All right. I am really excited to be joined today on Bad Faith Podcast by a fabulous panel to help us unpack what's been going on with the rail worker strike. We have Lauren Gurley, a labor reporter from the Washington Post. Welcome back, Lauren.
Thanks for having me again.
And Ross Grooters, a railroad worker. Thank you so much for lending your time to be here with us today.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, so I'll start with you, Ross. Where are we at this point in the negotiations, and what's the holdup from your perspective?
I think it's important to acknowledge that there's not just one rail labor union. So there's 12 different unions involved in the negotiation process, and each one is currently at a different point. I'm part of the operating crafts and a member of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. Currently, we have a tentative agreement, and that will go out to membership and go through a question and answer process before getting voted on sometime the middle of next month. And then we'll find out if members approve that process or approve that tentative agreement. Other unions are at a different point right now.
I see. So I was going to ask whether or not, your distinction that you made about there being many different unions is because there are, in fact, different interests being represented there. And if so, can you help us understand what those different interests are?
I think the ones that I can speak on best are the ones that unite us. And we all work for common rail carriers, the Class 1 railroads. We're all looking for safer staffing levels, safer working conditions. We all want improvements to our quality of life that have adequate quality time off. We're looking for paid sick time, affordable health care, and cost of living adjustments that will keep up with rising inflation.
So the tentative agreement, which came at the end of the cooling off period last week, to people listening to this, it'll be a week before last week. It was reported that it was kind of based on having secured 1 day of leave, which some people, remarked upon as surprising, given the reporting on how meager, frankly, the vacation time, sick leave time, et cetera, at the moment, at present, really is. Can you speak to, people's confusion or the disconnect that some people have between the idea that there were these significant, I think, weighty demands for having some real time off here for people who have been essential workers through this pandemic and this crisis, and the reporting that, at very least, the imminent threat of strike was put off by an agreement to 1 day of leave?
Yeah, I think the place to start is that the rail industry is unlike any other. Much of our industry, especially the operating crafts, are on call 24/7, 365 days a year, with the exception of any paid time off. Now that ranges from nothing for somebody who just hires out to somebody like me with a couple decades who might get somewhere around 30 to 40 days off paid a year. I think when I tell people that we don't get weekends off like everybody else, they're shocked. And so that's really what we're fighting for is to be able to exist in lives outside of the railroad instead of being on call 24/7 and really just always concerned with when the phone's going to ring for us to go to work next.
So Ross, when you say, you, someone who's more senior, has 30 to 40 days off, this isn't like the 2 weeks vacation that most, kind of more white collar workers are considering. This is days that we would consider to be weekend days. So, we would consider, there's like 100 days off a year. If you count weekends, you're saying that 30 and 40 is just you getting to that starting point.
Yeah, that'd be time off paid either through vacation or personal leave days. There are no weekends on the railroad.
Yeah, that's incredible. Lauren, I want to ask you, there was obviously a lot of kind of breathless and relieved, I think, reporting last Friday morning, or rather Thursday morning, when the tentative agreement was reached. And then subsequently, I saw a number of labor reporters, Jonah Furman in particular, warning folks not to characterize what had been achieved as kind of a total resolution of the crisis. Where are we now with respect to negotiations and particularly the Biden administration's involvement?
Sure. So the two largest unions and the two most powerful unions, SMART and BLET, which Ross is a part of, came to a tentative agreement last Thursday, like you said. Now they are going through what will be like a multi-week process where various union leaders who are below the top leadership review the contract language, and they vote on whether or not they want to accept that. And then they pass it on to their rank and file members, who will then vote. And that whole process is going to take over a month. I mean, we probably won't get an answer on that until sometime in late October. Meanwhile, as Ross was mentioning, there are a bunch of smaller unions that are in all these various different stages of accepting agreements or not having agreements. The one that's on my radar is that sort of could be the most important thing to pay attention to next week is the International Association of Machinists, which has about 4,900 members, so much smaller than these unions with tens of thousands of members. They are workers who fix rail cars and railroad tracks. And basically, they have voted down an agreement, and they have a strike deadline of September 29th, which is a week from today at noon, until they have that period of time. So basically a week to come up with a new tentative agreement. Otherwise, the window will open for a strike. And if they reach that deadline and they don't have an agreement, there very likely will be a strike. And it's not just those 4,900 members who would strike. All of the other railroad workers would likely stop working in solidarity with those 409,000 workers. So that would be like 115,000 workers who could go on strike as soon as next Wednesday or next Thursday.
So fascinating. There's a real lock and step. Despite the plurality of unions, there is a stated or at least tacit agreement that it's all or nothing. Everyone's on board or nobody's on board.
Exactly. Yes. And I think all the unions feel this way, is my understanding from talking to union leadership, is if one union goes on strike, we all sort of respect that picket line. We're not going to cross a picket line. So that could happen as soon as next week. Another piece of the story is that there are a bunch of other unions. One of them is a affiliate of the Teamsters, the Brotherhood of, I always mess up the name, Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees, which is a division of the Teamsters. They recently voted to their union leadership agreed to a tentative deal, and now workers are in a period where they're reviewing the deal. They're a little bit further along than these two huge unions. This is the third largest union. And I think among this set of workers, there is a lot of discontent right now and across the board. But they've been holding pickets today, informational pickets today and yesterday, dozens of them across the U.S. in Chicago, Seattle, Oakland, St. Louis, Kansas City. And basically, it's this sort of like ad hoc group that is formed, like totally independent of the unions, where workers are sort of expressing outrage about what was in the Presidential Emergency Board's deal or their agreement that Congress or the Republicans wanted to push sort of legislation through to force everyone to agree to. So
and quite a few Democrats, no?
Oh, and quite a few Democrats. It was only Bernie Sanders who basically blocked it. So basically, that there's this set of workers, and it's not just that one Teamsters union. It's basically it's workers across these different unions who are sort of like, we're not in line with what our union leadership the solutions that our union leadership has made in these tentative agreements, and so they're sort of educating workers at sort of railroad hubs across the United States over the past few days. I think there have been dozens of these pickets. I just spoke to one of the organizers on the phone a few hours ago. But what these workers are really frustrated with, which Ross was pointing to, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of these structural issues with understaffing and employment and being on call that they do not feel like have been addressed by, one additional sick day, or like this sort of promise that they can take time off without being penalized. They're not confident. I think that their concerns about basically safety and staffing have been addressed.
I mean, Ross, to the extent that you can tell us, what is the temperature like when you're talking to your fellow workers about the administration's role in this? Because I mean, that was a pretty big moment where there was this panel put together by the Biden administration to put together deal terms that were supposed to kind of force a solution. The Congress was going to try to, excuse the pun, railroad this through, until Bernie Sanders said that he wasn't going to vote for it, derailing. I'm really not trying to do this on purpose, but derailing the whole thing. And at the same time, Biden's being characterized as, the most union-friendly president in decades, and that can be true. And it can also be true that the way, the administration is positioning itself right now might be frustrating. What is the read from your perspective on how the administration is handling this moment?
So the Presidential Emergency Board that was established by the Biden administration, it's been some time since that recommendation came out from that board. There was frustration with it. I think there was a lot of people who I work with that had hoped that would be a path to win some of these victories. And what should be a pro-labor administration, unfortunately, had a board that recommended things that will not solve a brewing crisis on the railroads going forward. If this contract does not address these issues, there's going to continue to be attrition and a loss of workforce. And in the last, say, 5 to 8 years, we've seen a considerable decline in the number of railroad employees. And that's contributing to this point in time where people are just growing frustrated and looking for other solutions, including those outside the industry. And this contract, if approved, I don't believe will stop that attrition. And it's only going to exacerbate the supply chain issues that have been created through the pandemic. So I do think there is frustration with the way this is played out politically. But all we can do is continue to fight through the process under the Railway Labor Act.
I'm so glad that you brought up these staffing issues and the fact that there has been this really dramatic decline in the size of the workforce, to your point, over the past decade or so, but even before that. And you mentioned that you're relatively senior, having worked there. Did you say for a few decades?
Almost 2 decades.
Almost 2 decades. Can you speak to the changes that you've observed in the industry over that time?
Yeah, especially in the last really 3 to 5 years, maybe a little bit longer, there's been a push to increase operating ratios in the industry, sort of a financialization of the industry. Wall Street investors have come in and really tried to cash out and squeeze as much value as possible, as much shareholder value and as much dividend payouts as they can get a hold of. And those have come at the price of workers and at the price of the long-term viability of freight railroads in this country. So going forward, again, if this doesn't change, there's going to continue to be a labor crisis brewing on the railroads.
To what extent has there been kind of a pointed criticism of the people who own these railroads, the corporatists who are choosing to pursue this financialization path, using profits not to pay workers and invest in the business, but to pay out to shareholders? How much is changing that kind of corporate behavior a part of the negotiations that are going on right now?
Section 6 notices were served about 3 years ago. So we've been without a contract and without a raise for over 3 years. And I don't think at the beginning of that process there was an acknowledgement there. I don't know if that will change into the future from a rail labor perspective, but it's certainly known, and we've seen government bodies like the Surface Transportation Board take a look at this in recent months and try to unwrap the problems with freight railroads.
Because it does feel like ultimately you're going to run into this problem again if there's not a lesson learned by management about their longer term priorities. I mean, you spoke to the lack of sustainability in the industry as a whole, and I don't know exactly what happens if freight rail in the United States of America, with its enormous mass, doesn't have freight rail.
I'm not sure I can add anything to that other than I think that's spot on.
Yeah, I mean, look, I want to play a brief clip if I can, because I think so much of the story, part of what's so interesting about it is that the people involved are a group that is historically, at least superficially, valued in the public discourse on a bipartisan basis. There are other working class groups who, because they are less kind of traditionally working class blue collar jobs, let's say baristas or, the like, they don't get the same kind of respect when we're having these kind of conversations than people who are, hard hat wearing, dirt under nails, kind of stereotypical blue collar workers. And it's been interesting to see how various media spheres that typically are very supportive of workers like this in the abstract are talking about this when the labor implications are in conflict with some of the corporate interests that fund some of these media institutions.
The more worrisome impact is some of the less profitable parts of the economy, particularly trucking and other industries that are going to look at this, and largely the labor movement is going to be empowered. And I think this is not so much about the railroad specifically, but it's more worrisome about other industries that will look at this as a sign that labor has an enormous amount of power. And unfortunately, because there aren't a lot of alternatives for certain industries, particularly the ports, we're sort of going to have to deal with this and just face the reality that labor has a lot more power today than it has in the past 2 decades.
Well, that's what the administration has done. They're giving the unions the power.
So that was Craig Fuller, who's CEO of FreightWaves on Fox News. And the segment is being framed as how problematic it is and how worrisome it is that the rail workers are realizing or assuming this enormous amount of power. And there's a fear articulated here that other industries might follow suit. I mean, Ross, what do you make of that?
Workers have always had this power. We're just starting to rediscover it. And if there's that much concern, then maybe the best solution is just to ensure that the workers get a good contract and are kept happy. If we're that critical, then it's essential that we are well taken care of. And I just want to go back to something you said about how there is a discrepancy, especially in certain circles, between, say, a service sector job and something like my profession, and say that we need to pull down those barriers and those walls. There shouldn't be any difference. Shout out to Starbucks workers. There shouldn't be any difference between myself as a rail worker and somebody who is creating my pumpkin spice latte, because there's skill involved with that, and people have to put in the time to create that product.
Absolutely. And great shout out for the first day of fall when we're recording this episode. I mean, Lauren, let me ask you, because among the left, certain portions of the left have been very interested in this question of solidarity strikes. There was a general strike summit that was held, I believe, last year or earlier this year by the Revolutionary Blackout Network. But other corners of the left have been, very hesitant to even have a conversation about what that means. Obviously, general strikes, solidarity strikes are illegal strikes that hasn't stopped people. Obviously, there were these wildcat strikes with the teachers unions. I guess that was this past year, last year. But I wonder if you've experienced any murmurings about there being more solidarity actions even beyond these rail workers.
I have actually not heard a lot of sort of like talk of solidarity actions with these workers. I mean, what I will say and that's not to say that isn't being talked about. What I will say is that a lot of the working conditions that people are we're in a very tight labor market right now, right? Like there are two people, there are two job openings for every person in this country looking for a job, which means that like that sort of scenario has given workers a lot of leverage to sort of engage in sort of strike activity or to unionize, to sort of engage in different forms of labor activism. I've been seeing over the past few months a lot of labor activism around this. Like, I think there's a direct tie between like what Starbucks workers are fighting against and asking for and the railroad workers. Like for Starbucks workers, it's also about scheduling, right? Like they have no idea. They're always on call. They have no idea when they're going to have to show up to work. They're in a similar situation where they can't like live their lives because they don't know, or they can't hang out with their kids. They can't like sort of go on vacations because they don't know if they're going to be called into work. This is like a huge thing in leisure and hospitality, which is the same exact thing that the railroad workers are sort of describing. And I think you also see a lot of concerns over safety at both on the railroad, like derailments, people working, one person crews running like 3 mile long trains. Also true at Starbucks, but also true in the nurses' strikes last week in Minnesota, which were all about sort of nurse to patient ratios, not about wages. I mean, they were about wages, but that wasn't sort of the primary driving point. So a lot of this activism I've been seeing over the past month or two has been about labor shortages and about how, people quitting and quitting their jobs because of this tight labor market has sort of put a crunch or put them in sort of put them into a situation where they're doing more work than usual. It's more dangerous. And so I can see sort of people talking about their working conditions and describing the same things, and sort of a lot of solidarity just in people sort of relating to each other about what they're going through. I'm not sure about the general strike thing that could be happening. I haven't heard about that.
I mean, the funny thing is that there's been a conversation happening, frankly, since the beginning of the pandemic by some folks on the left. And maybe it was premature. I'm not a labor organizer. I certainly don't intend to speak for anybody or advance anything that might be contrary to the interests of the folks who really have, a stake in this. But there have been questions raised about whether or not various industries that are particularly powerful because their labor is particularly necessary to the functioning of the economy, whether it was Sarah Nelson and the flight attendants, whether it's rail workers, the fact, whether it's nurses in the context of the pandemic, whether or not one strike would cause a number of chips to fall that could result in the level of kind of fundamental change to our system and reverse the tide of diminishing rights and protections for laborers that has been happening for the last 40 years or so. And we got through this entire pandemic, nurses maligned the way they've been maligned, teachers largely ignored and abandoned in the classroom without, HVACs or things like that to keep the air clean, and now these railroad workers without there having been that tipping point. And it is really interesting to see it come down to this industry, which is so important. And these claims, these demands, which are so reasonable, right? At a time where we have given so much lip service to the value of quote unquote essential workers, whether or not these rail workers will feel sufficiently empowered to not just take whatever deal the Biden administration is trying to negotiate, or which bosses and managers are trying to negotiate, but actually start something that could be a broader movement. Does that feel like too much pressure, Ross? Is that something that you feel like, it's too difficult to engage with, given how much, the actual workers, your actual coworkers are dealing with right now?
I'm glad you're bringing it up, and these are conversations that do need to happen. I don't think it's on the forefront of coworkers that I work with. It is something, though, that Rail Workers United, the cross-craft organization I help co-chair, has had a lot of discussions on, is the supply chain and what's upstream and downstream and how do we make these connections. And so when you talk about the context of this contract situation, we've been having a lot of conversations with brothers in the Teamsters. I'm a member of the Teamsters Rail Conference, as is the Brotherhood of Maintenance Away Workers. So we've been having conversations to kind of work on cross solidarity, and they're part of the biggest part of the union is UPS workers, and they're coming up on contract negotiations in 2023 that are going to be critical for them. So just trying to build these relationships and find ways to support each other is important to me, and it is on my mind, but I think we have a lot of work to do in educating, and obviously you're a part of that right now. I also just want to echo something that Lauren said, and I think this is not necessarily unique to rail labor. I think when we look at workplaces as a whole, workers are being asked to do more with fewer people more quickly, and it's not sustainable. And so when we look at that and we see that the benefits of that work are going to the richest among us and aren't being shared the way they need to be with workers, then that's when people start to step up and fight for their fair share. And I think that's what we're seeing happen across a number of industries.
I think that's such an important point, because I think the instinctive pushback a lot of people have is going to be to say, well, of course I care about rail workers. Of course I want them to have vacation days, but if it's not happening, it must be because there's just not the money for it. There's been a pandemic, there's been a crisis, everyone's lost money, they must just not be able to pay. When, of course, it's quite the opposite because of the financialization that you describe, and because of, frankly, corporate greed and price gouging that has occurred during the course of the pandemic. There has been an enormous growth in wealth for the people at the very top of our society, just as everybody else is being squeezed and pushed even further to the margins. And that reality, I think, in part is obscured by the way these things are covered. Lauren, I want to say, if I haven't said already, how thankful I am to you for the amazing labor coverage you've been doing over at such a mainstream institution like the Washington Post. I want to ask you what you make of the coverage, because here's something I observed. I was trying to put together some notes for a radar monologue I was doing on the Hill Rising last week on this subject. And I found it incredibly difficult just to find basic information about what the current kind of vacation day off program is for rail workers. And I would read article after article after article, and I would scroll. And I'm like, why isn't anyone just saying the basic demand here? Because I do think that emphasizing how reasonable the demand is and how bad the working conditions are makes us a much clearer case in favor of laborers. And it feels sometimes like some corporate media outlets would rather obscure that reality purposefully. I mean, what have you observed in the coverage?
Yeah. Well, I noticed I noticed a lot of people who, a lot of mainstream news articles or articles from mainstream news outlets, not even they don't interview a single worker. There's no discussion of why the strike is happening, just that it's going to cause ordinary Americans a ton of pain. It's going to threaten the water supply and the food supply, and it's going to threaten retail and basically every industry. It's going to impact commuting and Amtrak and things like this. Yeah, I mean, I read so many articles where they didn't talk to a single worker. At the same time, I think there was there were mainstream news outlets that were interested in this story. I think from a labor-ish perspective, I saw a few places that were, and I think that there maybe, we were kind of talking about this, but there may be more sort of empathy from mainstream news outlets for the railroad worker as compared to the Starbucks barista, because they're sort of I don't know, the sort of prototypical ideal of what a worker is in the US. It's sort of masculine, and it's I don't know, a type of job that people are oh, that's hard work. Whereas you're saying, people aren't necessarily being a barista at Starbucks is hard work, even though it is. And so I think on the one hand, a lot of the outlets just overlooked the entire labor angle. I think one of the New York Times article that was on their homepage for a while did not address the labor question, or the labor piece. At the same time, there were outlets like CNN and places like this that did talk to workers and NPR that did look at the labor piece. But I think, I was curious as to whether maybe that was because it's railroad workers and like people, respect railroad workers as opposed to like the labor of other types of workers in this country that are dealing with similar labor issues.
Yeah, I mean, something I noticed, and this brings us to an interesting point that I also want to ask you about, Ross. Something I noticed when I looked at coverage across the ideological spectrum, whether it's Fox News or MSNBC or CNN, whether or not they tackled the labor piece, as you put it, Lauren, they did always also emphasize how hard it was going to be for consumers and did seem to position the average American as a consumer, that they should identify with the story as a consumer rather than as a fellow worker, which in my experience, my limited experience of having visited France briefly this summer during their transit strike, was not the perspective that the French people that I talked to had. We were in traffic. It was irritating. Everyone was hot and sweaty and tired. But when it came up, the driver was like, yeah, c'est la vie. This is what happens. This is their why. Maybe they strike so that we can all have rights. And everybody was like very like blasé about it to keep on with the French theme. In the United States, I think there is definitely a socialization that we've all had to see ourselves primarily as consumers. And that comes across in the reporting. However, when I scrolled to the comment section, regardless of how the story was framed, I was very pleasantly surprised about the uniformity of support for workers. And I wonder, Ross, do you feel that?
I think sometimes it feels like rail labor is insulated from a lot of the public just because we live such different lives in our day-to-day routines through our work. I guess what I will say is the connection there that I think you started to highlight was the supply chain. And I just want to impress upon people, whether or not you see yourself on the supply chain or not, you're on it if you're a consumer. You're that end point on the supply chain. So from the time I get a train of goods and deliver it to where it's going, eventually that goes down to the consumer level. So consumers are definitely an important piece of this. I think the big difference here is it's not necessarily just the shoulders of labor, whether it be transportation or what have you on the supply chain. The impetus is on these companies who are highly profitable and have the ability to fix this thing right now. Today, if they came out and issued the demands that workers are asking for and gave us something that would allow us to live lives and take care of ourselves and our families, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. So I do want to bring it back to these companies that have a lot of the power to end this today.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, what's frustrating to me when I see the emphasis on the consumer is that it's like you should be scared. I mean, like the whole point is, yes, these rail workers have a ton of power. And that is why it is so unconscionable that despite their ability to basically bring the economy to their knees, these corporate bigwigs are still sashaying around like they don't owe you a vacation day. I mean, the sorry, please go ahead, Ross.
Well, I was just going to share, and I apologize for jumping in there, but
no, please.
I think that that reporting, the frame of that reporting is to get the consumer upset with us as workers, but that's not where people's anger needs to be channeled. It should be focused on these companies that have created this crisis on the freight railroads.
100%. And Lauren, I saw you and Jonah Furman and some other good progressive labor reporters pointing this out before the end of the cooling off period, that there had been preemptive like work stoppages by the railroad owners in order to basically threaten the administration and say, this is how bad it could get. And a lot of that was being attributed to the workers. But the reality is, I mean, it's a complete reversal of the kind of responsibility there. the onus, of course, is on, especially given how reasonable the demands are, the onus should absolutely be in the characterization of this on the people who would rather basically shut down the economy and shut down the railroad than simply give workers, essential workers, in the most literal sense, vacation days.
Right. So yeah, I mean, in the like few days leading up to the deadline, the railroads were stopped like halting grain shipments, which freaked people out. They were putting a pause on like shipments of like chemicals like ammonia and gosh, I'm going to forget the name of the chemical that's needed to like purify water. But hugely important, obviously. Fertilizer, like all sorts of chemicals needed for agriculture. Just it seemingly, because the narrative that they were painting was that like workers are going to shut down the railroad system in a matter of days, and it would be dangerous to leave these chemicals sitting in the middle of a railroad somewhere because, like, I don't know, you don't want toxic chemicals sitting in the middle of nowhere or something. On the flip side, it looked a lot like the railroad companies were preparing for to lock workers out. Like they were sort of acting ahead of the strikers themselves or the workers themselves to sort of I think pressure special interest groups and Congress to sort of force a deal. And so there was sort of these two narratives going on, one from the railroad companies being like, we have to do this for safety. The other from labor being like, you don't have to do this for safety. You're acting like you don't want to, you're acting like you want to force this deal and force us into like create a situation where you don't have to give us a single sick day or something like this.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that was very interesting to see play out. And I think the narrative that won obviously was the one that, like, you know, workers are threatening a strike that could, you know, disrupt all of these like things that we need to sort of to function as a society, and they're the ones to blame. But yeah, I guess I definitely feel like that's the storyline that won, and it did definitely freak out a lot of people.
Yeah, this is a little bit of a frolic and detour, but I think it's important to note that this is a posture that folks are often put in, that people who are advocating for a better world, for improvements for the 99% are often put in, where there are these kind of framing devices used that put the onus on them for the bad outcomes of whether it's a labor action or something else. So, for example, right now we have the situation where, in order to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, Chuck Schumer made this side deal with Joe Manchin, and now Bernie Sanders is saying, I'm not going to support this side deal. I never agreed to this side deal. It has, you know, it's going to fund this Mountain Valley pipeline in West Virginia that has all the local people are protesting against because of the environmental impacts and yada, yada, yada. And now Chuck Schumer and Joe Manchin are framing this. They've attached that bill to a government funding bill and are threatening a government shutdown if Bernie Sanders and Tim Kaine and a couple of others don't get on board and vote for this thing. So they're saying Bernie's going to shut the government down, when obviously it's the case that, but for them having attached it to this spending bill, how Bernie votes on this thing would have nothing to do with the government, how the government gets funded. And I think that oftentimes progressives, social justice advocates, workers, laborers will back away from those arguments because they don't want to be characterized as having caused the bad thing to happen. But I think that's why it's so important to have voices in the media that reframe and recharacterize what's really going on here. And so again, I just want to say how much I appreciate you, Lauren. All of that being said, the remaining question that I have is about what people can do to be supportive who are themselves not unionized. Obviously, we have a workforce that is overwhelmingly not unionized because of union declines over the past decades. But who very much want to be supported and who, frankly, are very frustrated with traditional electoral political avenues as a means to advance the interests of working people. And I've heard people say things about how they are frustrated they gave their $27 donations, the recurring small dollar donations to any number of progressive candidates, who were thwarted by the Democratic Party or who got in but disappointed them because they didn't stand up for issues in the way that they would have liked. And they would much prefer to spend that money on either, direct action mutual aid or potentially donating to strike funds. And so I wonder, Ross, how, if there's any way that people who are not themselves a member of rail workers, obviously, or members of any other union can be supportive in this moment.
So that's one of the things Railroad Workers United has worked to do over the years is build solidarity. We're a dues-sustaining organization. Our dues are kept very low for railroad workers. And we also allow solidarity members to join for $25 a year, and it helps us sustain some of this work and get the word out. Railroadworkersunited.org, railroadworkersunited.org is our website. It's pretty easy to join as a member of that organization. The other thing I would say is just know that this isn't over yet, and there could be strike actions, picket actions, whether it be an informational picket or even potentially a rail carrier lockout. We could see that in the coming weeks and months, and just keep paying attention to outlets such as yours that are getting that information out there. And if and when it happens, I know here in Iowa where I'm at, you're welcome to join me on the picket line, and just look for those opportunities to stand in solidarity with workers. And as was pointed out earlier in the show, I think we find that we have more in common in different fields and industries and workplaces than we realize.
It's honestly, I mean, I'm torn between obviously not wanting to get too big for my britches and like speak for other people, but also being genuinely inspired by workers exercising their power and demanding what they obviously deserve. And, there's so much conversation in this country about how divided we are and how partisan we are. And I see this moment in this group of people who I'm sure have politics all over the spectrum, and many of whom probably wouldn't see themselves as aligned with some random socialist in Washington, D.C. But this does feel like a moment where we can transcend some of the ways that I think the media class will divide us up. And I would love to see all kinds of organizations stand in solidarity and also put their money where their mouth is with respect to supporting strike funds and becoming a solidarity member as you've advocated. And so thank you so much for spending the time with me today. And I definitely encourage all the listeners of Bad Faith Podcast, if they can afford to do so, to absolutely become solidarity members. Lauren, before we leave, can you let people know where they can find you on the internet and more of your terrific reporting?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. You can find me at Lauren K. Gurley as my Twitter handle, and my byline is Lauren Kaori, which is Kaori Gurley on the Washington Post website. And I don't just cover the railroad strikes; I cover the whole labor movement in the U.S. So gonna try to figure out what the next. I mean, I'm still on the railroad story, but also you'll find me covering other things. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Congratulations on the new job. I don't think we've spoken since you moved to the Washington Post.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well done. We love to see it. We really love to see it. And Ross, do you have any social media handles or anything that you want to flag for people?
People can find me on Twitter at Ross Grooters, RossGrooters, and just want to say I appreciate you both. Keep up the work.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you to our listeners. You can get 2 episodes, obviously, of Bad Faith a week. Enjoy these free Thursday episodes. Share them with your friends. And if you are unable to support the premium episodes, please do just consider liking, subscribing, sharing videos and interviews like these so that more people get eyes on them. And obviously, if you do want more Bad Faith, you can subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Again, don't forget about the solidarity membership. Take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.